HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Earth is Weeping, the epic story of the Indian Wars for the American West, by Peter Cozzens, read by John Pruden. If the lands of the white man are taken, civilization justifies him in resisting the invader. Civilization does more than this. It brands him a coward and a slave if he submits to the wrong. If the savage resists, civilization, with the 10 Commandments in one hand and the sword in the other, demands his immediate extermination. Report of the Indian Peace Commissioners, 1868. I remember that the white men were coming to fight us and take away our land, and I thought it was not right. We are humans too, and God created us all alike, and I was going to do the best I could to defend my nation. So I started on the warpath when I was 16 years old. Fire Thunder, Cheyenne Warrior. We have heard much talk of the treachery of the Indian. In treachery, broken pledges on the part of high officials, lies, thievery, slaughter of defenseless women and children, and every crime in the catalog of man's inhumanity to man, the Indian was a mere amateur compared to the noble white man. Lieutenant Britton Davis, U.S. Army. Prologue. Our children sometimes behave badly. Patrons of P.T. Barnum's American Museum in April 1863 were in for a treat. For 25 cents, they could gaze upon 11 Plains Indian chiefs just arrived in New York City from a visit to the great father president Abraham Lincoln. These were not the random beggars or drunken red men from eastern reservations that Barnum normally presented to the public, the New York Times assured readers. They were Cheyennes, Arapahoes, Kiowas, and Comanches, roamers of the remotest valleys of the Rocky Mountains. Barnum promised 3 dramatic performances daily, but the engagement was strictly limited. "Come now, or you're too late," trumpeted the great showman. "They are longing for their green field and wild forest homes, and must be seen now or not at all." Barnum teased New Yorkers with extravagant previews. He rode through the streets of Manhattan with the Indians in an oversized carriage preceded by a marching band. The great showman and the chiefs made stops at schools where children performed calisthenics and sang songs for them. Newspapers responded with amused derision, but the Indians captivated the public. Crowds flocked to the 4-tier theater of Barnum's Broadway Street Gallery to see staged powwows. The Indians said little, but their painted faces, long braids, buckskin scalp shirts, and scalp-trimmed leggings delighted showgoers. At the final curtain call on April 18th, Chief Lean Bear of the Southern Cheyennes bade New Yorkers farewell on behalf of the delegation. Chief Lean Bear was a member of the Council of 44, the governing body of the Cheyenne people. Council chiefs were peacemakers, enjoined by tribal custom never to permit passion to displace reason and to always act on behalf of the tribe's best interests, which in 1863 most elder Cheyenne chiefs construed as friendly relations with the mushrooming white population in the territory of Colorado that crowded their already diminished hunting lands. But official Washington was troubled. Confederate agents were rumored to be circulating among the Plains Indians, trying to incite them to war. To counter the threat, which was in fact baseless, and smooth over differences with the tribes, the Indian Bureau had arranged for Lean Bear and 10 other chiefs to visit the Great Father. The Indian agent Samuel G. Colley and their white interpreter accompanied them. On the morning of March 26, 1863, 2 weeks before the opening of their New York extravaganza, the Indians, their agent, and their interpreter had filed into the East Room of the White House through a murmuring throng of cabinet secretaries, foreign diplomats, and distinguished curiosity seekers. Maintaining that dignity or stolidity characteristic of the Stoics of the wood, a Washington journalist told his readers, they quietly seated themselves on the carpet in a semicircle, and with an air of recognition to the destiny of greatness to be gazed at, seemed quite satisfied with the brilliancy of their own adornings and colorings. After a 15-minute wait, President Lincoln strode into the room and asked the chiefs if they had anything to say. Lean Bear arose. As the crowd of dignitaries pressed closer, Lean Bear momentarily lost his composure. The chief stammered that he had much to say but was so nervous that he needed a chair. 2 chairs were brought, and Lincoln sat down opposite the chief. Cradling his long stem pipe, Lean Bear spoke, hesitantly at first, but with a growing eloquence. He told Lincoln that his invitation had traveled a long way to reach them, and the chiefs had traveled far to hear his counsel. He had no pockets in which to hide the great father's words, but would treasure them in his heart and faithfully carry them back to his people. Lean Bear addressed Lincoln as an equal. The president, he said, lived in splendor with a finer lodge, yet he, Lean Bear, was like the president, a great chief at home. The great father must counsel his white children to abstain from acts of violence so that both Indians and whites might travel safely across the plains. Lean Bear deployed the white man's war then raging in the East and prayed for its end. He closed with the reminder to Lincoln that as chiefs of their peoples, he and the other Indian leaders must return home, and Lean Bear asked the president to expedite their departure. Then Lincoln spoke. He began with good-humored but marked condescension, telling the chiefs of wonders beyond their imagination, of pale-faced people in the room who had come from distant countries, of the earth being a great round ball teeming with whites. He called for a globe and had a professor show them the ocean and the continents, the many countries populated with whites, and finally the broad swath of beige representing the Great Plains of the United States. The geography lesson over, Lincoln turned somber. "You have asked for my advice. I can only say that I can see no way in which your race is to become as numerous and prosperous as the white race, excepting living as they do by the cultivation of the earth. It is the object of this government," continued Lincoln, "to be on terms of peace with you and with all our red brethren, and if our children should sometimes behave badly and violate treaties, it is against our wish. You know," he added, "it is not always possible for any father to have his children do precisely as he wishes them to do." Lincoln said an officer called the Commissioner of Indian Affairs would see to their early return west. The chiefs were given bronzed copper peace medals and papers signed by Lincoln attesting to their friendship with the government, after which Lean Bear thanked the president and the council concluded. The chiefs' stay in Washington did not end with the White House meeting, however, as if the journey east had not sufficed to demonstrate the power of the white people. For 10 days, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs insisted on shuffling the delegation from one government building and army fortification to another. Then Agent Colley accepted P.T. Barnum's invitation to New York. By the time the Indians boarded a train for Denver on April 30th, 1863, they had been in the white cities nearly a month. President Lincoln's peace pledge rang hollow in the territory of Colorado, where Governor John Evans's idea of interracial amity was to confine the Cheyennes on a small and arid reservation. Although they had signed a treaty 3 years earlier agreeing to accept reservation life, Lean Bear and the other peace chiefs were powerless to compel their people to relinquish their freedom. Cheyenne hunting parties ranged over eastern Colorado and the unsettled western Kansas plains as they had always done. They harmed no whites. Indeed, the Cheyennes considered themselves at peace with their white neighbors, but Coloradans nonetheless found their presence intolerable. Governor Evans and the military district commander Colonel John Chivington, who had political ambitions of his own in Colorado, took dubious reports of cattle theft by hungry Cheyennes as an excuse to declare war on the tribe. In early April 1864, Chivington ordered cavalry to fan out into western Kansas to kill Cheyennes whenever and wherever found. Lean Bear and his fellow peace chief Black Kettle had passed the winter and early spring quietly near Fort Larned, Kansas, where they traded buffalo robes. Now tribal runners brought word of the imminent danger. Recalling their hunting parties, Lean Bear and Black Kettle started their people northward to find protection in numbers among Cheyenne bands gathering on the Smoky Hill River. But the Army found them first. On the night of May 15, 1864, Lean Bear and Black Kettle camped on a muddy cottonwood-fringed stream 3 miles short of the Smoky Hill. At dawn, hunting parties fanned out onto the open plain in search of buffalo. Before long, they were back, pounding their ponies to the lodge of the camp crier. They had spotted 4 columns of mounted soldiers on the horizon, and the troops had cannon. As the crier awakened the village, Lean Bear rode forward with the small escort to meet the soldiers. His medal from President Lincoln rested on his breast in plain view, and in his hand he carried the peace papers from Washington. From atop a low rise, Lean Bear saw the troopers at the same time they saw him. Their commander ordered his 84 men and 2 mounted howitzers into a battle line. Behind Lean Bear, 400 warriors from the village assembled warily. Lean Bear rode forward, and a sergeant cantered toward him. All must have seemed well to the chief. After all, he and the Great Father had pledged mutual peace. Dignitaries from around the globe had greeted him at the White House. Army officers in the forts around Washington had been gracious and respectful. The people of New York City had honored him. He had his medal and peace papers to prove that he was the white man's friend. But the Great Plains was a world unto itself. Lean Bear was just 30 feet from the soldiers when they opened fire. The chief was dead before he hit the ground. After the smoke cleared, several troops broke ranks and pumped more bullets into his corpse. As Lincoln had cautioned Lean Bear, his children sometimes behaved badly. A newspaperman once asked George Crook, one of the preeminent generals in the West, how he felt about his job. It was a hard thing, he replied, to be forced to do battle with Indians who more often than not were in the right. I do not wonder, and you will not either, that when Indians see their wives and children starving and their last source of supplies cut off, they go to war. And then we are sent out there to kill them. It is an outrage. All tribes tell the same story. They are surrounded on all sides. The game is destroyed or driven away. They are left to starve, and there remains but one thing for them to do: fight while they can. Our treatment of the Indian is an outrage. That a general would offer such a candid and forcible public defense of the Indians seems implausible, because it contradicts an enduring myth that the regular army was the implacable foe of the Indian. No epoch in American history, in fact, is more deeply steeped in myth than the era of the Indian Wars of the American West. For 125 years, much of both popular and academic history, film, and fiction has depicted the period as an absolute struggle between good and evil, reversing the roles of heroes and villains as necessary to accommodate a changing national conscience. In the first 80 years following the tragedy at Wounded Knee, which marked the end of Indian resistance, the nation romanticized Indian fighters and white settlers and vilified or trivialized the Indians who resisted them. The Army appeared as the shining knights of an enlightened government dedicated to conquering the wilderness and to civilizing the West and its Native American inhabitants. In 1970, the story reversed itself, and the pendulum swung to the opposite extreme. Americans were developing an acute sense of the countless wrongs done the Indians. D. Brown's elegantly written and passionately wrought Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and later that same year the film Little Big Man, shaped a new saga that articulated the nation's feelings of guilt. In the public mind, the government and the army of the latter decades of the 19th century became seen as willful exterminators of the native peoples of the West. In fact, the government's response to what was commonly called the Indian problem was inconsistent, and although massacres occurred and treaties were broken, the federal government never contemplated genocide. That the Indian way of life must be eradicated if the Indian were to survive, however, was taken for granted. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee still deeply influences the way Americans perceive the Indian Wars and has remained the standard popular work on the era. It is at once ironic and unique that so crucial a period of our history remains largely defined by a work that made no attempt at historical balance. D. Brown gave as the stated purpose of his book the presentation of the conquest of the American West as the victims experienced it, hence the book's subtitle, An Indian History of the American West. Brown's definition of victims was severely circumscribed. Several tribes, most notably the Shoshones, Crows, and Pawnees, cast their fate with the whites. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee dismissed these tribes as mercenaries, with no attempt to understand them or explain their motives. These Indians, like the Army and the government, became cardboard cutouts, mere foils for the victims in the story. Such a one-sided approach to the study of history ultimately serves no good purpose. It is impossible to judge honestly the true injustice done the Indians, or the Army's real role in those tragic times, without a thorough and nuanced understanding of the white perspective as well as that of the Indians. What I have sought to do in this book, then, is bring historical balance to the story of the Indian Wars. I hesitate to use the word restore when speaking of balance, because it is the pendulum swings that have defined society's understanding of the subject since the closing of the military frontier in 1891. Of inestimable benefit to my work has been the wealth of Indian primary sources that have become available since the publication of Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. They have enabled me to tell the story equally through the words of Indian and white participants, and, through a deeper understanding of all parties to the conflict, better address the many myths, misconceptions, and falsehoods surrounding the Indian Wars. A myth as enduring as that of an army inherently antagonistic toward the Indians is that of united Indian resistance to white encroachment. No tribe famous for fighting the government was ever united for war or peace. Intense factionalism ruled, each tribe having its war and peace factions that struggled for dominance and clashed sometimes violently with one another. One of the most committed advocates of peaceful accommodation with the whites paid for his convictions with his life. A disgruntled member of the tribe's war faction poisoned him. Unanimity existed only among tribes that accepted the white invitation. Influential chiefs such as Washakia of the Shoshones saw the government as guarantors of his people's survival against more powerful tribal enemies. The Shoshones, Crows, and Pawnees all proved invaluable army allies in war, following the adage that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Not only did the Indians fail to unite in opposing the westward expansion of civilization, but they also continued to make war on one another. There was no sense of Indianness until it was too late, and then it came but dimly through a millennial faith that brought only bloodshed, horror, and broken hopes. Intertribal conflict was in part the consequence of a fact that has never been appreciated, but that will become apparent as this book unfolds, that the wars between Indians and the government for the northern plains, the seat of the bloodiest and longest struggles, represented a displacement of one immigrant people by another rather than the destruction of a deeply rooted way of life. A decade after Lean Bear's murder, an Army officer asked a Cheyenne chief why his tribe preyed on their Crow neighbors. He responded, "We stole the hunting grounds of the Crows because they were the best. We wanted more room." That was a sentiment that the Coloradans determined to rid their territory of the Cheyennes could readily appreciate. Part 1. Chapter 1. The Plains Aflame. President Lincoln vastly understated the case when he told Lean Bear that his white children sometimes behaved badly. In the 2.5 centuries between the settlement of the Jamestown colony in Virginia and Lincoln's cautionary words to the Cheyenne chief, a relentlessly expansionist white population had driven the Indians westward without regard to treaty obligations or sometimes even simple humanity. The government of the young American Republic had not intended to exterminate the Indians, nor had the founding fathers simply coveted Indian land. They had also wanted to enlighten and refine the Indian, to lead him from savagery to Christianity, and to bestow on him the blessings of agriculture and the domestic arts. In other words, to destroy an incompatible Indian way of life by civilizing rather than by killing the Indians. The civilized Indians would not live on their homeland, which the federal government meant to purchase from them at the best possible price by means of treaties negotiated on the legal premise that tribes held title to their land and possessed sufficient sovereignty to transfer title to the true sovereign, that is to say, the United States. The federal government also pledged never to deprive the Indians of their land without their consent or to make war on them without congressional authorization. To prevent settlers or individual states from infringing on Indian rights, in 1790 Congress enacted the first of 6 statutes collectively known as the Non-Intercourse Act, which prohibited the purchase of Indian land without federal approval and carried stiff punishments for crimes committed against Indians. Not surprisingly, the punishment provision of the law quickly proved toothless. President George Washington attempted to intercede on behalf of the Indians, to whom he insisted full legal protection must be afforded. But his admonitions meant nothing to the land-hungry whites living beyond the government's reach. In order to prevent a mutual slaughter, Washington sent troops to the nation's frontier. Once sucked into the fray, the small American army spent 2 decades and nearly all its limited resources in wresting the Old Northwest from powerful Indian confederations in undeclared wars. That set a dismal precedent. Henceforth, treaties would be a mere legal veneer to conceal wholesale land grabs that Congress tried to palliate with cash annuities and gifts of merchandise. After George Washington, no president lost much sleep over Indian rights. Indeed, the executive branch led the way in divesting the Indians of their homelands. In 1817, President James Monroe told General Andrew Jackson that the savage requires a greater extent of territory to sustain it than is compatible with the progress and just claims of civilized life, and must yield to it. As president in the 1830s, Jackson took Monroe's injunction to its harsh but logical extreme. With the authority granted him under the Removal Act of 1830, and by employing varying degrees of duress, Jackson swept the roving tribes of the Old Northwest beyond the Mississippi River. When Southerners pressured him to open Indian lands in Alabama and Georgia, Jackson also uprooted the so-called 5 civilized tribes, the Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks, Cherokees, and Seminoles, and resettled them west of the Mississippi River in Indian Territory, an unsustainably large tract spreading over several future states, which was gradually reduced to comprise solely present-day Oklahoma. Most of the civilized Indians went peaceably, but it took 2 long and bloody conflicts for the army to dislodge the Seminoles from their Florida strongholds, and a handful ultimately were allowed to remain. Jackson never doubted the justice of his actions, and he truly believed that once beyond the Mississippi River, the Indians would be forever free from white usurpation. Fur trappers, traders, and missionaries would be permitted to pass through the Indians' new home and venture out onto the Great Plains or into the mountains beyond, but there assuredly would be no further upheaval because Army explorers had reported the Great Plains as unsuited to white settlement, and the public took them at their word. But already there were pressures on the periphery. A burgeoning fur trade on the Missouri River expanded white contact with the western tribes. Also, the removal treaties bound the federal government to protect the relocated tribes not only from acquisitive whites, but also from hostile Plains Indians, who had no desire to share their domain with newcomers, be they Indian or white. Meanwhile, white Missourians and Arkansans demanded protection from the dispossessed Indians in the event they found their new land somewhat less than the Eden they had been promised, which they did. The government's answer was to build a chain of 9 forts from Minnesota southward to northwest Louisiana between 1817 and 1842, creating a tantalizing abstraction known as the permanent Indian frontier. Of the 275,000 Indians whose homelands lay outside Indian Territory and beyond the newly constituted military barrier, the government cared little and knew even less. White conceptions of the Indians of the American West were simplistic and tended toward extremes. Indians were either noble and heroic or barbaric and loathsome. But when the permanent Indian frontier crumbled less than a decade after its creation, A cataclysmic chain of events suddenly brought whites and Indians face to face west of the Mississippi. The first crack in the permanent frontier appeared in 1841. Lured by the promise of fertile land in California and the Oregon country, a few lumbering caravans of white-topped prairie schooners ventured tentatively onto the plains. The trickle soon became a torrent, and the rutted wagon road thus created along the shifting sands of the dreary Platte River became etched in the nation's psyche as the Oregon Trail. Then came the annexation of Texas in 1845, and a year later the United States and Britain settled a contentious dispute over the Oregon boundary. In early 1848, the war with Mexico ended in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, by which Mexico ceded California, the Great Basin, and the Southwest, as well as its claims to Texas, recognizing the Rio Grande as the international border. In just 3 years, the United States had grown by nearly 1 million square miles and become a continental nation. Expansionist orators exhorted Americans to fulfill the nation's manifest destiny by emigrating to Texas, California, or the Pacific Northwest. No one as yet considered the Great Plains other than a vast and tedious obstruction. In August 1848, gold was discovered in California's American River. The following year saw a mass migration unequaled in the young nation's history. Within a decade, there were more whites in California than there were Indians in the entire West. Genocidal gold seekers decimated California's peaceable small tribes, and the growth of white settlements in the newly organized Oregon Territory alarmed the stronger Northwestern tribes. As yet, there had been no open conflict with the Indians in the West. But the peace was tenuous, warned the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. The Indians, he said, had abstained from attacking emigrant trains out of an expectation of reward from the government and not from fear, because they had not felt our power and known nothing of our greatness and resources. They would not feel that power for some time to come. The government lacked anything resembling a coherent Indian policy, and the small regular army needed time to build forts in the West. In any case, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs need not have feared any great concerted resistance to the white deluge. For one thing, the Indians did not perceive the white onslaught for the apocalyptic threat to their way of life that it was. But even if they had, the Indians of the American West had no common identity, no sense of Indianness, and were too busy fighting one another to give their undivided attention to the new threat. And this was their Achilles' heel. Only in the Pacific Northwest were the Indians able to unite against the sudden and vigorous white expansion. Few tribes in the West proved able to maintain the internal unity necessary to oppose the white advance. Nearly every tribe broke into two factions, one advocating peaceful accommodation with the whites and adopting white ways, the other holding fast to the traditional ways, resisting the government's enticements to go peaceably onto reservations. The government grew adept at exploiting these rivalries, giving the Army a potent fifth column in its battles to bring the hostile Indians to heel. The Army would also come to benefit immeasurably from the intertribal warfare that lay at the very foundation of the culture of the Indians of the West. That the Army needed Indian allies in order to prevail would prove axiomatic. In the relations between tribes, there was nothing subtle. Outsiders were either allies or enemies. The most intense intertribal conflict occurred on the northern plains, where warfare was fluid and continuous, as tribes struggled to conquer or protect hunting grounds. Tribes everywhere in the West survived and prospered by entering into alliances. Those that went it alone suffered horribly. Open battles were rare. Wars normally took the form of endless small raids and counter-raids that chipped away at the loser's domain. On the Great Plains, the foundation of the Indian way of life was the American bison, commonly known as the buffalo. Buffalo meat was a staple. From the hide, the Indians fashioned robes for warmth and trade, containers for transport and storage, and skins for the distinctive conical teepee, also known as a lodge. No part of the animal was wasted. Not only did the buffalo undergird the economy, but it also shaped the Plains Indians' religion and culture. Well before the first American ventured beyond the Mississippi River, The European gifts of horses, guns, and disease had radically altered Plains and Rocky Mountain Indians' cultures. In the 16th century, the Spaniards had introduced the horse to the New World. As the Spanish frontier pushed into the present-day southwestern United States.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?